Good evening, Berean. It's good to be with you on this Lord's Day as we gather again to spend some time in the Word of the Lord with each other. Well, this morning we continued our study of the fifth part of the fourth division of the book of Acts, which we have entitled Paul's Arrest and Journey to Rome. The first portion of this part of Acts deals with Paul's arrest and trial in Jerusalem. And we're looking at point A that I've given you, which is Paul agrees to display his commitment to the nation. This is verses 17 through 26. This is a difficult text and notoriously difficult interpretive challenge. But we tried to lay out a case, I think, that fits the evidence of what we see in the text here this morning. And so we divided this part of Acts, verses 17 to 26, into three subparts. The first was the handoff, and I called it the handoff because this is where Paul gives the money that he raised to the church in Jerusalem and the consequences of that. And so we looked at the welcome in verse 17. I argued that it was in the general meeting with the entire church that Paul gave the offering over to the leadership that he had raised. And then the second part was the reports. This is verses 18 through 20. And in these reports, we have the Gentile mission first, verses 18 through 20a. And Paul here, Luke just gives a summary of what Paul said. Obviously, there's no reason to repeat what took place in the previous chapters because we already read them. And so Luke just simply gives a summary statement of Paul's ministry. And Paul really didn't focus on his ministry so much as he focused upon what God was doing through him. And then we have the Jewish mission. This is the last portion of verse 20. And we see here that there were many Jews coming to the Lord, and we came across this challenging statement. They were zealous to keep the law. Zealous to keep the law. And so, zealous for the law. So I spent quite a bit of time on this phrase. I wanted to make sure you understood what he was saying. When he talked about being zealous for the law, it wasn't zealous for the law in the salvific sense of the word. Of course, we know that you can't get saved by keeping the law, but the Jews tried to. But that wasn't what Luke was talking about. It was a zealousness for the cultural and ceremonial aspects of the law. Things that the Jews were free to do, they weren't required to do by God anymore, but they were free to do it. And of course, many Jews chose to do it as a cultural stamp upon their life. They identified as Jews and wanted to look, dress, eat, and so on. Although they didn't have to anymore, they wanted to continue to set forth their Jewishness as they understood it, their ethnic nature. And so that's what he means by zealous for the law, zealous in that sense, cultural sense. But there was a problem, and we looked at the problem. This is verses 21 through 22. And here we saw that the leadership in Jerusalem was dealing with a lie that had been told about the Apostle Paul and his ministry. Now, I traced this lie, if you followed me this morning, I traced this lie back to the areas in which Paul had ministered in Asia Minor, in Greece, in Macedonia, because obviously there was no way for the people in Jerusalem to know what he taught. And so this is coming from the Gentile regions. Jews are traveling back to Jerusalem. They see all the Jews getting saved and leaving Judaism for the church, and their response is to say, well, Paul is teaching this type of thing all throughout the Gentile territories. And so we looked at the The two areas of concern, of course, were Paul telling Jews that they were not supposed to circumcise their children, and they weren't supposed to keep the cultural aspects of their Jewishness going. And so we looked at the areas of concern and then the sources of concern. And when we looked at the areas of concern, it was pretty clear that Paul didn't teach any of that stuff. The things they were saying that he taught, he did not teach. And that's pretty clear as we went through those areas of concern. Then we looked at the third area, which was the solution. So the eldership, the leaders of Jerusalem Church, had been thinking through this for quite some time, apparently, and they had a plan. And the plan was laid out in verse 23 and 24. The plan was simply to allow, they had some men in the church who were on a Nazirite vow. And so they told Paul to join in on the Nazirite vow. Now, this, as I argued this morning, this shouldn't surprise us. We saw Paul keeping a Nazirite vow in Acts 18, verse 18. And so this was not something outrageous that Paul didn't do himself. You know, people argue that, well, they're asking Paul to do something he wouldn't normally do. Well, that's not true. I mean, he in Acts 18:18, he was on a vow himself that required him not to shave his hair, so it's probably a Nazirite vow. And so we looked at the plan. We looked at how they differentiated what was going on here with what they had decided earlier in Acts 15. Of course, Acts 15 was where they had made a decision about Gentiles not needing to keep the law in order to be saved. And so the leadership wanted to differentiate between that and what they were asking Paul to do. And so they made that clear in verse 25. And then in verse 26, we have the follow through where Paul goes through with what they said and carries it out. And so that was the message this morning. Any questions on the morning's message? Go right ahead. So the question was asked me this morning about the sacrificial part of this. From the text, there's no reason to argue that they didn't do the sacrifices. I mean, Luke is pretty clear. I mean, when you look at verse 26, it says, "Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them." And so it's pretty much impossible to argue that Paul did not make any sacrifices that day. They were made. So I would argue that the sacrifices were made in the prescribed manner they were supposed to be made, given the nature of the Nazirite vow. Yeah. Any other questions on the morning's message?
Being zealous for the law, it just throws me kind of off. Because it just seems like if you're a Christian, I'm imagining these are Jewish Christians,
Yes.
still zealous for the law. But why? I mean, what's it, now that you have freedom in Christ, you know Christ, and I understand you're talking about they're just adhering to their culture, so I guess circumcision isn't anything salvific.
Yeah, I mean, circumcision.
Separate that from, I guess, what I've been believing. If you say that you're keeping the law, it seems to be contrary to what you are as a Christian.
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult thing for us to understand. This is kind of why I tried to put it in terms that maybe we have a little more understanding in the modern context. I use the illustration of India and certain things in India having both a cultural and a religious significance. When Indians get saved, they want to continue to look Indian. They're in an Indian culture, they want to look Indian. And so they, for example, you know that some Indians wear the dot. Well, that has religious significance too. And so there are some Christian Indians who wear it and some that don't wear it. The ones that wear it argue that they would wear it for cultural reasons. And they have some good arguments for why they want to present themselves as Indian, because they're Indian. I know that now no one wants to argue, and I hope this wasn't what people got from it, was that the Jews had to do this. But the issue was that they could do it. So they could circumcise their children. They could continue to eat kosher. They could continue to dress without mixing different material. And so they were free to do it. Now, they were free not to do it, and many Jews didn't do it, particularly those in the Gentile regions, but many Jews did continue to do it. These were not salvific issues. They weren't doing it so they could be saved. They weren't doing it so they could be accepted by God. They were doing it in order to fit in with the Jewish culture as Jews, because that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to. I tried to stay away from the idea of being. So many of you know that I'm a foreigner, and so the U.S. is not my. It's not. I know some of you. What? I thought you were American. No, I'm joking. Yeah. So I'm from Canada, but I'm not even technically from Canada. I wasn't born in Canada. I was born in the West Indies. My parents were born and raised in Antigua. I was born but not raised in Antigua. We moved away when I was about 3. But one of the things that my parents did when they went to Canada was they joined a West Indian cultural club. And they would go on a regular basis and meet with other West Indians. They'd eat West Indian food. They'd talk West Indian news. They continued to have cultural links with the Caribbean, or Caribbean, however you want to say it, culture that they were raised in. Now, there wasn't a religious significance to it, obviously, like in the case of the Jews, but are we really surprised that people who are of a particular ethnicity want to identify with their ethnicity? I mean, that's really not a surprise to us. People do it all the time. Now the challenge, of course, is that in the case of the Jews, some of their cultural links were religious in nature. And so those aspects had to be done away with. And so there was no longer a religious significance to those things, but there was a cultural link that they wanted to maintain with their Jewish ethnicity. And so this is definitely different than what as I said in the morning's message, we're Gentiles who have been reared on Paul's teaching on the law. And so, we read a statement like this, and it's alarming to us. It's disorienting to us. And that's why I tried to stop, let's pull back, and let's analyze what's actually going on here, so that we could stay away from the, and okay, let's kind of think about this and look at it in the cultural setting in which it took place, and as a manifestation of the Jewish culture. And so that's kind of how I would put it.
Yeah, it seems difficult to remove the religious aspect from, because they were serious.
Oh yeah.
Religiously, to the point that if you didn't do, you talk about death. If you don't do certain things.
Sure.
That aspect of it, that's just not cultural. That's, this is who we are. Unless maybe you said that they are, they're not Christian. They're just Jews who are.
Well, the broader Jewish community would have continued to have a cultural / religious perspective on those things. Christian Jews would not. They would just continue with the cultural aspects of the law, if you will. And so, although you can look at the broader Jewish group and say they're zealous for, I mean, some of you may be thinking about Romans 10, where he talks about they have a zeal. And so the unconverted Jews were zealous for the law, but that wasn't what he's talking about here. They were zealous for the law as a mechanism for salvation. That's not what these Jews were concerned with. They were concerned with the cultural, identifying as a Jew culturally, not salvifically, how you got saved. And so although Paul does use the word zeal in Romans 10 to describe Jews and the law, it's not the same as what's going on here. Yes?
Christ's death, the resurrection, to AD 70, when did the Jews, most people think, they stopped doing offerings, sacrifices?
Which Jews? Unsaved Jews or saved Jews?
Well, saved Jews wouldn't be doing it.
Paul made sacrifices right here.
So he'd be bringing a burnt offering in.
I mean, how do you understand sacrifice in verse 26?
I agree with that.
Okay.
That's another point.
Okay.
Because I'm saying if you say you don't need to bring no burnt offerings because Christ has already died and he's fulfilled all that.
So when these people bring sacrifices to the temple, what are they doing? They're memorializing Christ, right? They're memorializing Christ's sacrifice. But Paul would not be making sacrifices with the understanding that they had any atonement in them. So how could he make them? Well, we would argue that he made them in a memorial sense. They were as a picture of Christ. There's no other way to figure this out, because he's clearly making sacrifices.
And I agree with that. Mm-hmm. But my point is, today.
Well, this is not possible after 70 AD.
That's what I'm saying. So I'm saying they continue to bring their little sheep up there, because before Jesus came, he was looking for him to come to fulfill all of those things. So after Jesus has done all that, okay, he's gone up and returned to heaven. There was no need to bring a burnt offering because he's already fulfilled all that.
Yeah, there wasn't a need to bring it, but clearly they're bringing sacrifices. Yeah. I don't know any way around that. That's what the text says. I believe the text, and so I would just have to say that they were bringing them in a memorial sense, in remembering Christ's sacrifice. Otherwise, you end up having to deny the obvious. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with your take on that, Pastor Skeppel, because while the temple was still there, things were still probably not fully clear as far as the cutoff, although they knew consciously, okay, Jesus paid the price, the temple's still there, and, you know.
Yeah, I don't know any way around that. I mean, I think you're pretty much stuck there. I mean, when you, and some people say, well, it just seems weird to me. Well, yeah, because you weren't there. I understand it's weird. It's weird to me too. But what are you going to do with the Bible? You either have to affirm what the Bible affirms or say that Paul was wrong. And some people, some commentaries say that Paul was wrong. He shouldn't have done this. Some commentaries argue that the church twisted his arm. You know, that they made him do this against his will. I don't know whether that fixes the problem. I mean, to me, that makes it even worse. because then you end up with a spineless Paul, which I don't like that option either. And so I'll come to you in just 1 second. I was talking to a brother after church who had some questions along these very lines he was concerned about, and I said, well, I mean, in Acts chapter 3, Peter and John are going up to the temple to pray. My question was, they couldn't pray in their house? I mean, how do you get around the obvious? I mean, when in Jerusalem, they continued to use the temple and the temple ceremonies as a reflection of their faith in Jesus Christ. I don't know any way around that plausibly that I've heard. Now, again, my mind can be changed through the Scripture all the time, but you're going to have to come with some evidence. Yes, go ahead, brother.
Yeah, I was just going to say things were still kind of in a fluctuation point until
Sure they
the
were.
temple went away to fully complete that. That's over.
Sure they were.
It's definitively over.
Well, yeah, I mean, in 70 AD, that's it. It's done. And now, one of the brothers came up to me after church and was talking about, well, in your system of eschatology, you all have a future temple, and what's going on in the future temple? Okay, and so there's some discussion that still is in play here. I'm not going to get into that this evening, but these are important discussions. I don't want to make light of them. I definitely understand why people struggle with a text like this. It's a challenging text, without a doubt. I mean, there are things in the text that we, being so immersed in the writings of Paul, are just not used to. We're not used to the idea of somebody going to the temple and making a sacrifice. It's strange to us, and so we struggle to deal with it. Go ahead.
Did some of those things evangelistically, like, I guess, to get a foot in and be able to speak to the Jewish crowd so he gets circumcised?
Well, I mean, he gets Timothy circumcised, and the Bible says that he got, because everybody knew his father was Greek. Everybody knew his father was Greek, and so Paul said, I better circumcise. So he circumcised. Paul didn't seem to have any problem with it. And why is it a problem for a Jew to be circumcised? Paul said that there's no problem with circumcising. Now, again, remember how the text flows. That's Acts 16. Well, earlier in Acts 11, when they're in Jerusalem and ask for Titus to be circumcised, what does Paul say? It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So Paul has no problem saying, don't circumcise, but don't circumcise Gentiles. Jews are a whole different matter.
But that's no different than today if you go to different places around the globe, okay? The cultures and their uniqueness is very, very strong. And though you have Christians in those cultures, the salvation issues are pretty clear, and it doesn't bend to those cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. What I tried to do, now some people are not going to agree with how I interpreted this text, I understand that, but I tried to interpret this text in such a way as to not argue that people were sinning. I don't see this text pointing out any sin here. And so because I don't see the text pointing out sin, I don't think it was right for me to impose sin into this text. I think everybody in this text operated in good faith. And everything from the suggestion to the implementation of the suggestion by Paul, I don't think we help this text by arguing that Paul was basically weak here and he was compromising. I don't think that does anything for us as an interpretive model. And so my interpretation doesn't end up with Paul being a compromiser. Paul here is free to do this or not do this. It's a conscience issue. And so Paul, because of what I referred you back to 1 Corinthians 10, because Paul said, I don't want to unnecessarily offend a Jew, a Greek, or a Christian. I don't want to. Now, sometimes you can't help but offend them, right? Because I'm not going to compromise the truth for either of those groups. But if you don't have to offend somebody, why would you? If you don't have to. And so Paul agreed to this because he was free to do it. And Paul was a Jew. I mean, it's not like Paul is a Gentile and Paul is a Jewish man himself with a Jewish heritage. And so Paul said, to the Jew, he became what? A Jew. To those under the law, he became what? Under the law. To those without the law, he became what? Without the law. Paul had no problem just kind of flipping the switch whenever he needed to, culturally speaking. Culturally speaking. This is a difficult text, isn't it? Any other questions on? Appreciate that. Appreciate that. Any other questions on this text? All right. Well, praise the Lord. Let's move to our Bible study this evening. We're in Titus.